In part 3 of the A-frame shelf build, I'll be tackling the walnut shelves from glue up, cutting rabbets, and to adding some bow ties. Since all the walnut panels are book matched, I'm working in pairs. I start by laying my two pieces of my panel on the bench and seeing if I have any small gaps or seams. And most likely I will, so I take them to the joiner where I run the edges through the joiner to make sure they're flat. You can see here I have a feather board to help keep pressure against the fence. One thing that's hard to see is I'm actually running the opposite faces against the fence to cancel out any joint or error. From there I move on to glue up, which is pretty straightforward, just 2 panels. After the panels come out of the clamps and dry, it's time now to cut them to their final length. I start by squaring one end and making that cut. I will then flip the panel over, measure the dimension I need, mark it, square it up, and cut that on the table saw as well. One thing you see me do quite often is rechecking for square. This panel cutting jig sometimes can be a little inaccurate, so I make sure I mark square on the piece and then modify the piece against the fence to make sure I get a square cut. After the panels are cut to their appropriate length, it's now time to determine how deep of a rabbet I need in each panel. Since the router table is going to be removing material, I'm taking measurements of the panel thickness, the groove thickness, which is 1/4 inch, and that determines how high the router bit has to be out of the router table. Here with this paper, I'm trying to show the math, but it's simple subtraction. My wife and dogs decided to make a small visit to the shop, so a nice distraction from the work. All right, now we're back at the router table. I'm determining how high the router bit is actually sticking out of the router table using just a simple steel rule and the light from my phone to get a better view at the increments. Once I get the router table dialed in, I'm always a little on the conservative side. I can always take more material away. I route the panels, the 3 edges, the 2 sides, and the rear. I will then test the fit of these panels within each shelf. Most of them need a little bit of hand fitting, so I took a shoulder plane and fitted each shelf to each shelf support doing this method. After each shelf was fitted into its shelf support, I would mark where the outermost edge was to cut the shelf to its total width, fore aft. At this point in time, all the shelves are long, and they need to be cut down in size to fit appropriately in the shelf support. The shelves were cut at a 10-degree angle, which matches the angle of the front leg on the A-frame. After all the shelves had been fitted by this method, a few of them had some checks that had to be addressed with some bow ties. So visually, I laid out what the bow tie should look like in angles. I made the rough cuts at the bandsaw, and then I come back to my workbench and a chisel and smooth out and clean up the bow tie. And you'll see throughout here, I check quite a few times that it's square to the surface. I want to make sure when I insert that bow tie, if there's any skew or angle, it's not going to produce an unsightly gap. This is somewhat of a long process for me. I need to develop a little bit better method to cut my butterfly keys or bow tie key method. The bandsaw leaves a little bit too rough of a surface, and it takes quite a bit of time with the chisel. Once the keys are all squared up and cleaned up, it's now time to transfer their size and position onto the actual shelf pieces. You can see here I'm using a piece of double-sided tape and a marking knife, and I'm tracing the exterior of the butterfly key with the knife and pull off the tape. What you may not see is I do mark what side of the key coincides with what side of the shelf. It's pretty easy to get them spun around and have a ill-fitting gap. Alright, once the keys are completely traced on the walnut panel, I have a very small router bit in my palm router. I think it's a 1/16 inch, or maybe it's a 1/8 inch bit in my palm router. And what I'm doing is I'm hogging out most of the waste with a palm router just to alleviate a lot of the chiseling work needed. The router bit has been set to the appropriate depth. In this case, it's not the depth of the key, but just how deep I want the key to go. I can always flush the key up with the surface later. After the majority of the material is removed with a router, I moved on to chisels. I believe this is a 1/2 inch chisel I'm using here. I also have a smaller 1/8 inch chisel sitting there on top of the walnut panel. I use both of those in conjunction just to clean up all the excess material. and come back to my lines that I marked out with my knife. At this point in time, I'm feeling pretty confident that the key will go into its cut hole here. So what I'm doing is I'm chamfering the very bottom of the key on all the edges to help it get started into the opening, and as well, if there's any type of missed material in the very bottom, it won't leave the key off the bottom surface. So I apply glue inside the opening, spread it around to make sure I get all the edges as well as the bottom, and then I pound the key into place. After the key has dried for just a few minutes, I take a block plane and flush it up to the surface. After addressing the checks with the butterfly keys, it was now time to move on to everyone's favorite woodworking activity, which is sanding. On these walnut panels, all 10 of them, I did 80 grit, I think 120, 150. I then wetted the surface to raise the grain, did 150 once again, and then hit it with 220 before applying the oil finish. I decided to try straight boiled linseed oil on these walnut panels. It's a pretty simple method to bring out that grain and that natural luster in the walnut. After letting the oil sit on the surface for 15 to 20 minutes, I came back through and wiped off all the excess. And this is what the panels look like after that excess is wiped off. One thing I didn't capture on video on that previous panel was that there was some knots and some voids that had to be filled with epoxy and scraped flush and then sanded with the panel before applying this oil. That essentially does it for the walnut panels and part 3 of this build. Thank you for watching.